Our scripture today is from the book of James. If there are any wise and learned among you, let them show it by good living, with humility and wisdom in their actions. But if you have bitterness of jealousy or self-seeking ambition in your hearts, be careful, or you'll find yourself becoming arrogant and covering the truth with lies. This kind of wisdom doesn't come from above. It is earthbound, it is animal-like, and it is demonic. Where there is jealousy and ambition, there is also disharmony and wickedness of every kind. The wisdom from above, however, has purity as its essence. It works for peace, it's kind and considerate, it's full of good, nor is there any trace of partiality or hypocrisy in it. Peacemakers, when they work for peace, sow the seeds which will bear fruit in holiness. Ancient words from our tradition, read for our present day understanding.
Thank you, Eddie. He's good at that. You can disregard the next passage, at least for this week. One of the mistakes I most persistently do as a minister, although there are many candidates for that in terms of mistakes, but probably the one I do the most that I'm aware of anyway, is naming my sermon before I've done the biblical studies. Particularly the language studies, because what something looks like in English, and when you look at the roots, it can take some really nasty turns on you. And that's what happened this week. We're doing a series on how the church needs to change to be a gift to the future. And definitely one of them that's coming down the pike, maybe next week, is this idea of the church moving from belief to awareness. Because I think healthy religions don't brainwash you. And a lot of us were raised in traditions that filled our heads with ideas, and we're supposed to believe in them, in the ideas themselves. And I don't think that's the gift that Jesus wanted to give people. We will probably look at that this week. But as I looked at this passage, it was much more about wisdom. And wisdom in the ancient classical sense of a great virtue. Now, the difference was, I think, that the people in the church believed that all the virtues, there were like 4 classic virtues that you heard time and time again. There's wisdom, there's justice, there's temperance, and there's courage. And you'd hear those, and in the early church, those were more like pillars for the life of love. So wisdom is part of love. As we're seeing in modern Christianity, if you can believe any kind of ridiculous thing, you can join yourself to horrendous causes. You can attack things just because you don't understand them. And there's courage. You can't love if some politicians can make you afraid of people who are different than you. It can move you from one scapegoat to another. Moderation, temperance, as long as you believe in capitalism and you think value comes from owning things and possessing things and controlling things, you're not going to get the beloved kingdom that Martin Luther King talked about. We call it kingdom. But when your worldview, your value system is artificial, you're not going to value nature enough to save it. Right? Nature shouldn't have to justify itself to us. Other people shouldn't have to justify themselves to us. The animals, the plants, all of these things should be the source of value, not what they can be exchanged for. Justice, the rest, courage. I believe that in the book of James, we are getting a kind of time capsule into the early church. I spent a lot of time reading the first couple of centuries of the Christian church and checking it out. It's very different than what the church became in Europe. And so the Reformation that I'm talking about is plugging back into the roots. What happened along the way is Jesus kind of got put in the outhouse. Right? When people say, what is a Christian? Then some people say it's what you believe. You're a good Presbyterian, it's, just belief in get together like cockatiels and say the same words, and then you'll be saved. Or do the same ritual, or become a moralist and just spend your life spanking other people for Jesus, and then you'll be saved. But what James is saying is, if you're really so wise, then show me with the life of love. Now that's the kind of faith that could change the world. Doctrinal Christianity is only going to make things worse. Moralistic Christianity is only going to make things worse. Magical, ritualistic Christianity is only going to make things worse. The good news is the roots are still there. And I would imagine that's why when you hear that message preached, you recognize it with your heart. And you've known that since you were a child. Right? That the preacher is full of hooey, and that it's about love. And not just romantic feeling. The great virtues: wisdom, temperance, courage, justice. So, what we're going to look at today, I believe that every religion, world religion, no matter how great they are, it's like finding a partially opened umbrella. You see what people were longing to discover. You look at Paul and you see his agony. There's something being born in him, but it's not ready yet. Right? And what happened is he got frozen, half open. He was on his way to universal love, but he wasn't there yet. And that's going to be true, I think, of any religion. And in some ways, that's more helpful than getting the finished product. A scripture that tells you the good, the bad, the ugly. And you see that, you go, ooh, no, I don't want to go that way. That's more helpful than something that requires perfection to understand. So we understand there's a lot of hit and miss in this. So whereas much modern religion says, pretend to be moral, pretend not to have any temptations, pretend like you're absolutely this pure person. Jesus condemned that his whole life. That's called hypocrisy. The word comes from the Greek word for a mask. It's the mask that actors wore. So when Jesus talks about hypocrisy, it's not the insulting term it is in English. It's saying when you pretend your heart isn't there, you can't feel your own heart. You're betraying yourself and you don't even realize it. That idea that faith means arguing on behalf of ideas that don't make any sense to you, but you're believing because some book says it or some preacher says it. That's not what Jesus was trying to do. Jesus said the truth that he was going to teach would set you free, not give you a permanent cage for your mind to live in. And then finally, this idea that Jesus wants us to force Christianity on the world. That's as far from what Jesus taught as you can get. This modern white Christian nationalism is as far from the Sermon on the Mount as you can get. That what Jesus was calling us to is kindness. Not Christianity, but kindness. And this is like 101. If we don't understand this, it's all going to turn bad. Not religion, but living and loving. Being a good Christian is not going to save the world. Being a human being will really help. So we're going to look at this passage and see if it helps us understand these roots. And again, I suspect these are things that you've known since you were a child, that there's something really wrong with what you're being taught, but that there's also roots in there that are important. So this first idea that religion is a kind of mask that you wear, and you're trying to appear righteous, is again very far from what Jesus taught. Martin Luther hated the book of James. And it's understandable. The early church didn't talk about Jesus all the time. The book of James mentions Jesus twice in passing. Because when you have a mature faith, you don't have to talk about religion all the time. Somebody who talks about religion all the time, you know, is an immature person. Right? You want the finished product. None of the stuff about salvation, I mean, you could read that into there, but you didn't have this 2,000 years of theology projected on what Jesus taught. Right? You look at the Sermon on the Mount, where did Jesus say, you know, my dad has a temper problem? So if you don't mind, I'd like you to eat my body and drink my blood. Hang with me here. And then you won't go to hell. Well, that's a healthy religion, I think. Don't think, just do what the book says literally. None of that is what Jesus taught. There was a wonderful philosopher who used to tell the students, he'd say, when it comes to philosophy, don't show me your exercise equipment, show me your muscles. In other words, don't quote the Bible to me. Let me see the love that's grown in your life, the wisdom, the courage, the temperance. Show me the finished product, not the scaffolding. Because religion is scaffolding. I think it's very helpful. I mean, I've lived my life doing that, but it's not the point. Religion is not an end in itself. It's either helpful means to get to living and loving, or it's a trap. It's a trance. It's a swindle. So, in this passage, James says, wisdom begins with purity. Forget the church for a second. What is a pure human being? Pure water is water that doesn't have anything mixed in it. Pure wine is wine that doesn't have anything mixed in it. A pure human being is not pure at being religious or Christian. They're pure at being human. They don't wear a mask. They let you see who they are. They're authentic. That could save the world. Doing the Jesus impression is not helping anybody. So the first thing I think this passage is saying is take your masks off. There's a word in this little phrase there. It uses the word hypocrite, then it puts an A in front of it, which means take it off. So it's basically saying part of what makes you wise is to unmask, to be able to stop pretending to be more than human, because that only makes you less. So the first is this unmasking. The second is to become a reasonable person. Wisdom makes you a reasonable person. And you look at a lot of modern Christianity, and it's pretty whack-a-mole, right? It's pretty crazy. And it's understandable. It's not that people are bad, but when you're taught not to trust your own reason, your own discernment, your own heart, you're lost and you start trusting these hucksters. And it leads in so many horrible situations. Did Jesus teach using dogma? Think back to stuff Jesus actually says in the book. Did Jesus teach in dogma? Did he ever mention the Trinity? I mean, you can kind of read it in there if you want. But there's none of this horrific stuff about God being so angry. And God wants to hurt us, but Jesus will step in and take the bullet for us. I think Paul came up with that to help people that were already afraid of hell. And I think that was helpful for some people to get out of their fear. But what the modern church is doing is teaching people to believe in hell first and then saving people from it, which is a racket, right? To get you to believe in hell or demons or shame or any of that stuff is not what Paul was doing. For all his problems, he was dealing with people that were already afraid. They were terrified. And he was trying to say, Jesus will take you beyond that. One of the words that James uses here is one of my favorite, and you see it in Paul as well. And it never gets translated very well. William Barclay said it's the most untranslatable word in the New Testament. But what it means is being willing to be talked out of your position, being willing to yield to reason. Is that what you were taught in catechism class? That if a better idea comes along, that wisdom is letting go of what you believed and following truth? How different Christianity would have been if that word had been translated and not just kind of erased. Believing that God exists may be comforting, but it brings nothing ethical to the world. James is the one that said, well, the demons believe that God exists, right? And they probably believe that Jesus was resurrected and all that stuff. But what they don't believe in is love. Right? A demon would know that God exists if demons existed. And so what James is saying is that can't be the answer. Belief cannot be the answer. It has to grow, and it has to be a wisdom that grows into love. When Jesus told people, this is very important, when Jesus told people to believe in him, it's really important to realize he was standing right in front of them. Right? I mean, if I said, believe in me, y'all wouldn't go home and say, well, you know, I believe Jim exists. I believe he was saying he's a magic guy, and if I, surrender my heart, mind, and strength, that you'd understand it just means trust. Explore, give me a chance to persuade you. So I think to realize that Jesus is wanting you to keep your mind and your heart. Then the final thing I think that James is saying is wisdom has to make us kind. It has to make us kind. Because wisdom is only one aspect of loving. And it takes wisdom to love a human being. It's not easy. It can be really hard. This passage is translated horribly, I believe. And one of the mistranslations is where it says, but if you have bitter jealousy, which doesn't fit in the rest of the passage. The word jealousy in Greek can either mean jealousy or it can mean zeal. And the church didn't want to go there. But what I think James is saying is when your zeal for religion or Christ makes you bitter, makes you cruel, it's not the wisdom that Jesus was talking about. And he's giving you the signs like cruelty, argumentativeness, divisiveness, being on one side as opposed to the other side. Those are how you know you're doing it wrong, James is saying. And he uses a word in Greek, it's praus, it means gentle, but it's the gentleness of wisdom and age. It's not weakness, it's not cowardice. You ever seen a dog and a puppy's pulling on the ears and the dog is okay with it? If it was weak, it might not be able to do that. It's strong enough to be gentle. And I think James is talking about that kind of gentleness. And it's so important to realize that kindness has to grow into justice. Because what justice really means is kindness that applies to everybody. Not just you, not your family, not your nation, not your religion. Justice is when kindness applies to everybody. And that's when the umbrella opens up all the way. That's when your personal affection and compassion becomes a passion for everyone. So when we look back at James, there's a lot of the church that doesn't like James. It's kind of relegated almost as bad as the Sermon on the Mount. One thing you'll never hear fundamentalists talk about is the Sermon on the Mount, because it doesn't fit with any kind of fundamentalism whatsoever. Turning the other cheek? No way. But not judging other people? What are you talking about? What am I supposed to do with my life? James is a glimpse. You don't have to study the early church. If you want to, that's called the Ante-Nicene writings. But that's more work than you need to do. James gives you a really good clue that you've been right all along. It's about kindness. It's about wisdom. It's about taking the masks off not putting them on. It's about having a trust that includes reason and science. It doesn't have to be dishonest in the search for truth, which is a bit of a contradiction. That leads you to a kindness that applies to everyone. Or to summarize it all in one phrase, the way James did, if you really are so wise and so smart, show me by living a life of love. So that's my struggles with the text. We'll take a minute now for you to think about how you would have preached this.